So I'm a master's student, but I did my undergrad in wildlife biology, hard science, and I had the opportunity to TA for an introductory biology class several times for a specific professor. Now, this professor is great. I really liked him. We had a great relationship. And then after I graduated, I went into biology education to get my master's. Now, I learned things such as words like active learning, I've never heard before. Think, pair, share. And I watched my advisor do active learning in the classroom, and it was very eye-opening for me because I'd never even heard of it before. Now, I had the opportunity to TA for that same professor, and I was shocked after I learned all these things to realize that he taught lecture the entire time, and he was teaching an introductory biology class. And I thought to myself, why is he doing this? And I'm sure you guys have all run into this in your own colleges and your own universities. So we know that evidence-based pedagogy is a better way to teach the classroom. Active learning, like Dr. Freeman already told us, is beneficial for the students. But what are we seeing happening today? We're seeing that reform not really taking effect, and we're still seeing this problem happen. And the question is why? And we've also seen this idea in literature that teachers teach the way they were taught. How many of you guys have actually heard that before? I'm really curious. Oh, good. So lots of you guys have heard it. Okay, so I was introduced to this idea, and in a lot of the opinion articles and books, they were saying that maybe the reason that teachers teach using a traditional approach instead of reform teaching is because they teach the way they were taught. And I was interested to see if this was the case. Now, I went ahead and researched the idea that teachers teach the way they were taught, and what I found was that there's about 20 peer-reviewed articles over the last 30 years that have mentioned this idea in the literature. And I looked over these articles, and I found that basically what they would do is they'd say this idea, but they wouldn't really cite any evidence. About 90% didn't. And about 10% provided limited evidence, but it seemed like this idea needed to be researched more, especially if it was causing such a problem in our schools today. So my hypothesis was that instructors at colleges and universities teach using a more traditional approach because they teach the way that they were taught. And we wanted to test this idea in our university and colleges. So our objectives were to first determine empirically whether teachers teach the way they have been taught, and then to attempt to explain why this pattern exists and what factors influence teaching practices. And for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to substitute teacher-centered for traditional and student-centered for evidence-based pedagogy. And that's just because I wanted to look at a classroom and I wanted to measure how student-centered it was. Whether it was active learning, problem-based learning, cooperative learning, any of those techniques, I wanted to see if those were going on in the classroom. So for our methods, we first initially interviewed life sciences faculty at Brigham Young University and simply asked them, why do you teach the way you do, and what influences the way that you teach? And the reason we did this was that we needed to develop some instruments in order to measure how student-centered an instructor was. And the reason we were doing this instead of using something like the RTOP, the Reformed Teaching Observation Protocol, was because we needed our participants to self-report on their past experience, how student-centered their past experience was. And if I had all my participants answer a 50-question survey for multiple instructors, nobody would participate, right? Because can you imagine how much time that would take? So we had to make sure that it was a very short instrument that we were having them fill out, because otherwise nobody would have participated for sure. After we developed these instruments, we tested them on those same faculty at Brigham Young University. And then based on the results we got back from them, we made further refinements. And we were basically looking for, is our instrument clear and concise? Do they understand what we're measuring? And are we actually measuring what we wanted to measure? Then we had our final products after we did those refinements, and we took them to 43 instructors at 7 different colleges and universities in the state of Utah. And you can see those different colleges are in the bottom right corner. Lots of rivals. But we went, since this was a volunteer basis, study, we were really lucky to get 43 instructors that actually volunteered for this. Our criteria for choosing these instructors was that they were teaching an introductory STEM course with no lab, because we didn't want them to be able to rely on a lab experience for their teaching. And then last, we went ahead and surveyed, observed, and interviewed all of these professors in the state of Utah. So you can imagine how much traveling and time that took. The most important thing from that we developed in our instruments was this continual scale, and it measured how student-centered an instructor was. And we looked at 5 different categories to do this. The first was the behavior of the instructor, then the behavior of the students, third, the methods of delivery, fourth, the time focused on the instructor versus the time focused on the students, and fifth, the frequency of in-class assessments. Each question was worth up to 20 points, so an instructor could score anywhere from 0 to 20. And then when you added all these points together, it ended up being a score out of 100, which measured how student-centered the instructor was. Now, we now have this continuum where 0 was more teacher-centered and 100 was more student-centered, and we found instructors between those. Now, the instruments, first the survey, we had them evaluate their past instructors, and based on the interviews that we had with our preliminary faculty, we decided on 3 different categories of past instructors. Now, the first one was we had them evaluate their past instructor for the class most similar that was used in this study. So if they were teaching an introductory biology class, we had them evaluate the previous introductory biology teacher. Now, the second group we had them do was their past instructors for their core science classes, and we had them just group them into one lump. And then we had them evaluate their past general education instructors. So we have those 3 groups, and then we also have them evaluate themselves. How student-centered do you think you are? And last, for the survey, we collected demographic and pedagogical variables. Now, for the observations, we collected 3 full class periods that were scattered at random throughout the semester, and then we had 2 raters score these observations and come up with 1 score. For the interview, we basically asked them a series of questions. Why do you teach the way you do? What influences you? What inspires you? What is driving your teaching methods? So from our results, we first looked at inter-rater reliability, and we found that between the raters, there was a 0.868 correlation, and that correlation was significant. And so what we were able to conclude from this was that there was substantial agreement between the raters, and so we felt confident proceeding with our study because there was such high agreement between the raters. We also looked at how well the participants self-report or self-evaluate themselves. And what we found was that there was a difference between the score that we gave them and the score that they gave themselves. And this difference was significant. You can see, however, that when we ran a regression between the 2, there was very high correlation, 0.784. And so while we can say that instructors do not accurately self-report, we can say that the participants still understood the parameters that we were measuring because there was such high correlation, but that they were inflating their own scores by about 13 points. Our first question was, do teachers teach the way they were taught? So we compared each participant's student-centered score with those three different groups, and what we found was that they were different. They were significantly different. And so I want to show you the first graph here. So we have a student-centered score on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have our past instructor. And you can see there's no correlation. Here's the next group, no correlation. And here's the final group, pretty much 0 correlation. So our hypothesis was not supported. We can conclude that there is no relationship between the way teachers teach and the way that they were taught. What factors predicted a higher student-centered score? We looked at about 14 different factors. What we found was that years since terminal degree, years teaching the course that was used in the study, position type, whether tenured or non-tenured, and age were significantly correlated. And so we looked at each of these. We found that younger teachers teach in more student-centered ways. there have been fewer years since their terminal degree, if there have been fewer years teaching the course, and you can kind of see a cutoff there at 8 years. If you taught the course 8 years or less, you taught way more student-centered, and then it just tapered off from there. And then if you're actually in a non-tenured position, so if you're not an associate professor and if you're not a full professor. Now, research institution wasn't quite significant under our adjusted alpha correction, our adjusted p-value, but it was certainly suggestive of a pattern that could be looked at in the future. And under this, research institutions taught more student-centered. So we looked at our interviews and we came up with 10 common responses that the participants would give. And the two most common responses were, I teach the way I prefer to be taught, and I teach the way I think students learn better or best. And these were both in the 70s. So I teach how my teachers taught was very, very last, about 12%. So we can say that it seems that teachers are more likely to teach the way they prefer to be taught or the way that they think students learn best, not the way that they themselves teach or were taught. So then we looked at some different groups. We looked at the motivation and if it was more student-centered or not. And we looked at those who had listed a motivation that was pedagogical, like I read books or I went to conferences. And then we also looked at groups that stated the logistical reasons. I just teach this way because I have a large class size. And what we found is that those who mentioned the pedagogical reason actually taught more student-centered than those who did not. As well, those who mentioned the logistical reason, those who mentioned a logistical reason taught in a less student-centered way than those who did not mention a logistical reason. And this is to be expected, but it was interesting that these were our results. So from this, we have new hypothesis. Instead of teachers teaching the way that they were taught, they're teaching the way that they prefer to be taught or the way that they think that students learn best. In other words, teachers aren't computers. They're not just regurgitating what they've experienced. They're not having an input and giving an output. They're selective in how their past influences the way that they teach. It seems like they go through this metacognitive process where they reflect on how they were taught, if it worked, and if they liked it. So they're more likely to use a method that they liked and discard methods that they did not like. They'll use a certain method if it was a positive experience for them. That's why they're teaching the way that they do. So our implications for this is mostly with reform. It's kind of costly, but we need to do it. And our findings suggest a different approach to reform that may be rewarding, that we want to study in the future. In conclusion, our results reinforce the importance of exposing teacher to teachers to current evidence-based pedagogy in classes, because they will teach the way they were taught if it was a positive experience. Now for current teachers, those who teach higher education already, reform efforts may be more effective if teachers are able to go through a metacognitive process and reflect on the student-centered teaching approach if they're actually able to do what their students are doing. I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators, John Bell and Rick Gill from BYU, as well as the undergraduate researchers who helped code the data. Are there any questions?
So you were emphasizing the
Can you use the microphone?
I'm trying to
Push it.
different ones. Or
You have to push it down?
Yeah, it's not.
it's down.
Okay.
Please talk now.
Better?
Yes.
Okay. So I can't turn to look at you now. But so you were emphasizing more of sort of the they were doing this for a positive effect. I'm curious if there was any evidence in your data of any kind of a negative attribution when people reflected on this more and thinking back to their own experience and that they personally didn't learn that much in more of a lecture environment, and so because they had had a previous negative experience, that was why they switched to the more student-centered focus?
Oh, definitely. That came up quite often. So it seemed that they were emulating good professors, and they would disregard methods from bad professors. So if they didn't like it, they wouldn't use it. but they were selectors, so they used things that they did like. And that was one of the motivations that they mentioned in the interview. So that came up for sure. Yeah.
Was there a real variation in how teachers were taught? Like, was there a lot of active learning in their pasts?
That's a really good question. There wasn't a lot except with the younger teachers. So the younger teachers seemed to be taught in a more student-centered way, except we were seeing that many of those were now, many of the instructors teaching right now, we did see a variation between how student-centered or not they were. And so that could be a reason is these older professors may have been taught in a more teacher-centered way, but even still, the teachers who are teaching student-centered, they didn't have that in their own past education as much. There were instructors that did have it, but not as much.
This is sort of along, excuse me, those same lines, but were you able to gauge how well your participants were able to evaluate their teaching instruction? I mean, I had undergraduate biology 25 years ago. I don't even remember who taught it, and so I'm curious about your demographics, you know, with regard to that, and then also if they self-inflated their own teaching, you know, whether they were able to really accurately, especially those that had it so long ago, evaluate their teaching.
So you want to know about the demographic as far as like
Of your participants. I mean, was it skewed towards younger instructors that actually remembered what their introductory biology experiences were?
You can't really account for everything when you're doing a study, right? Yeah. So that's certainly something that could be happening. But we did look at we had them evaluate themselves, and then we compared that to how, to the score that we gave them. And so we did look at that, and they did inflate their own scores, but there was a significantly high correlation between the two.
Are you planning on
Are
you planning on looking at K-12 teachers who are in their classes right now and following them up and seeing how they are teaching? Because that would be the true, like, that would be related back to the conclusion.
That would be a great study to do. We did colleges and universities because, as I'm sure you know, IRB is a nightmare for K through 12. But that would definitely be a follow-up study that we could do. Yes?
Yeah, there's been a ton of studies doing similar work in K-12, but I'm really happy that you're following this up in colleges and universities. You were able to recruit 40 or more people from 7 different places. Can you speak to ways that you recruited? What worked for you? What would you advise other people to do if they're trying to do large-scale faculty research like this?
Well, first I sent out an email to them, and I made sure that I had a large sample size to start out with. So I had about 80 to 100 professors that I initially started out with, and then I did follow up.
So wait, how did you come up with that list?
I just went on each website, and so for example, the University of Utah, I went on their list and I saw who was teaching that fall, and I would email the director and ask for their email information or their phone information. And this was a very long process. I worked on it like half of a summer because people were really reluctant to give that information to me. So I had to really dig on the internet. I was doing a lot of internet digging to get that information.
So it wasn't a list that just existed already, you had to create it?
No, I created it. I decided which universities I could logistically go to. They were about an hour away. And then I worked from there. And so for some of the universities, such as like Brigham Young University, I got a lot of recruits from there because I'm already from there. And so they were more receptive to me. And then some of the other universities, like Utah State University, I only had a few from there. And so they were scattered. They weren't homogeneous across all the universities. But that is a good question. It was a lot of work. It was a lot of work.
We have time for maybe one more question if we're going to keep on time.
Yes.
Are you concerned at all that there might be bias to who would be willing to actually volunteer for this? Maybe less student-centered instructors are reluctant to, engage in a study about student-centeredness, and that might be something cool.
Yes. No, that is a very good question. Something important is I did not tell the instructors what I was doing or what I was measuring. I just said, I need to have you take a survey, I need to come watch you, but I never told them any of my research until they asked me at the very end of the course.
after I collected all the data.